It's a little after 5:15. I'd like to call this regular meeting to order and recognize everybody in the audience this evening. Would you please stand and recite the pledge with me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Moving on to school board norms. Bob, would you like to read those?
Sure. The board developed norms are to share and respect varied opinions and speak with a united voice once a decision has been reached, to prudently prioritize resources in a student-centric manner that aligns with the district's strategic plan, to exhibit a mindset of continuous improvement through adequate preparations for meetings and a commitment to board education, to commit to assessing board effectiveness to ensure high-quality governance for the staff, students, and community of Jamestown.
Thank you. Moving on to conflicts of interest, or public communication, excuse me. We have nothing under public communications. Any conflicts of interest to declare? Hearing none, moving to consent agenda. Motion to approve. Motion by Bob, seconded by Gail. Any discussion? Hearing none, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving into our regular meeting, we have nothing under recognition or correspondence. Moving into reports, negotiations seminar review. Who, did you go on that, Bob, or?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Go ahead, Gail, you can go first.
I thought it was good. I didn't mind doing it on the virtual format. I did the second day. The first day, I felt like I had pretty much a handle on all of the different things that were a part of that day. It was good, easy to understand.
Okay.
And also, interesting having been on the other side of negotiations as a teacher before. It was interesting to hear it from a board perspective.
Okay. Aaron?
Yeah, I think it gave a pretty good insight to how the structure and process. I attended both days, so I got to see hear about the employee leave details, the teacher non-renewal, certified staff contracts, and then the second day being the negotiations part of it. So getting a better understanding of the process was helpful.
Okay.
And the approach on the negotiations was interesting in terms of the structure behind it, in terms of the required steps on recognition of who's the negotiation parties, and then and how you can you treat the administrative different than the certified staff and teacher contracts. So yeah, it was helpful. It was helpful. So
Okay.
it'd be good going forward.
How Century Code, dictates a lot what we do too. So.
Yeah.
Bob, you have anything to add, or?
I still have 2 sessions left to watch, and
Well, that's the most important too. So.
well, yeah, I've been through those. I like when I took copious notes on the legislative issues,
Yep.
and I didn't bring them, but that's always interesting. It's like they always say, it's not the bills that are passed that are important. Sometimes it's the bills that aren't passed. I think
Right.
Dr. Leck has talked about that too. So that was good. It's always a good refresher. I especially, I'm looking forward to the 4th session, the second one in the afternoon on Friday, where they have a group discussion, a panel on negotiations issues. That's always best, and I just haven't had a chance to watch that yet, but I will.
Okay. The only thing I watched I was on the second day, and like Bob said, the legislative updates and stuff they had. That's what's interesting to me. So, I've been through a number of negotiation seminars and kind of a routine, but it's always good to hear it again too. So, moving on to superintendent's report. Rob?
Thank you. You have my written report, and I'll touch on a few items here. In terms of instructional plan, the team met electronically And the recommendation is to continue along in instructional plan 1. If you can, as you can see from the reporting tables, we're continuing to report those weekly, every Friday. That goes out to our staff, and then that also goes out onto our website. We've seen the largest spike that we've had since mid-December. We do know, luckily, we are pretty heavily invested in collecting our data, and so we know that there are some isolated situations here that have caused our numbers to spike. It isn't something that is necessarily a systemic concern. I'll give you an example. We looked, I ran my data tables this morning as well, and that impact is cut in half to around the mid-30s if you looked at that impact today. So we know, but I'll tell you, there's a reason why we continue to focus on that county data and state data is important to us, but the number one driver has to be what's happening in our schools. Sometimes, if we made decisions solely based on what was happening at the state or county, we'd be missing the boat. And so we need to continue to gather data that makes sense for us to make these decisions. Like I said, a little bit of a spike here, but nothing that I would find to be of concern. And we're already moving back in that same track, so a little blip on the radar screen. But just wanted to reinforce the reason that this is operating so well is because of our staff. Our staff is committed to those strategies, supporting those strategies that we know to be effective. And there's a reason why we've been able to do what we've been able to do, and that's because our staff is doing such a fantastic job with all of these issues in front of them. So great kudos to our staff again. I provided a little bit of update on the UJ JPS shared project, the practice field, the locker rooms. I think UJ has really done a great job. I want to give credit to Dustin Jensen at the University of Jamestown. He is representing all of us very well. He gives a lot of notes, construction notes to me, to Mr. Roltson, JLG provides a nice schedule, or J.E. Dunn, excuse me, provides a nice schedule, a 4-week schedule. Their monthly progress reports are really great for us to follow along to see what's happening. Related to our locker room project, really disappointing as we've continued to have those discussions. The board has allocated $500,000 out, and that's been disappointing to see as the market has changed, has shifted, as materials have increased. Those costs, what we'd hoped to provide at that $500,000 budget is probably closer to $1 million if we wanted to get that, what we talked about last time. So I really think that puts us in a holding pattern. I know that JLG, the architect, would really like to see an agreement before the board, and that agreement is actually up for you later on in this agenda. My recommendation is till we can get a closer path to a pathway to either exactly what we want or what we can get for the money that we're willing to commit. I think we're in a holding pattern with that as well. And so my recommendation would be to hold off on any agreement with JLG until we get to a point where we know what what exactly we want to do in terms of that facility. Like I said, that's disappointing to me, and it's certainly nobody's fault. It's just the nature of construction, and I would hope that we would have been closer to those plans we reviewed. I think there's an awful lot of work that's gone into that, and it was disheartening a little bit to see, the total costs on those. I thought we were a lot closer to that $500,000 range, or even if we had to extend a little bit more. But that's where we're at, and that's my recommendation moving forward with that JLG agreement.
Bob, you had a question on that, or? Your mic's on.
There. First, is there going to be a problem with the delay in the agreement in having things done by fall? And is it going to be necessary to have a special meeting to make sure that we can move forward in a timely manner?
Well, I think that we need to make sure that we have a pathway to the building that we want or the building that we're willing to accept at a certain price point before we commit the dollars to fund the drawing. So I think that's has to be for us priority number one, that we make sure that we have a pathway to that particular facility, and then we go from there. And if that pushes us a little bit later in certain areas, I think we just need to accept that rather than expending dollars that we may not want to yet.
Melissa's got one question for you, too. Melissa, go ahead. You put it up against your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My question was, are we locked into having to use JE Dunn for that portion of the project? I know we're doing the project together with UJ at the UJ site and for the field on our site, but for that locker room, can we put that out for bids and see if we can get maybe a better price on doing that?
So that's just an estimate. We would bid that out. So that's just an estimate that they provided to us. We would bid that out. So we're not locked in. Can you hear me okay?
Melissa, can you hear Rob?
No, I didn't hear what you said, sorry.
You want to just relay that? Just relay that to her that we would bid it out.
Rob said we would get it out, Melissa.
So we're not locked in.
Okay, so we're not locked in.
So one potential pathway, depending on how the board wants to proceed with this, and I think this comes over time. This is absolutely not a decision I would want you to make tonight or expect you to make tonight. But I'm later on today going to be providing board education on the different ESSER programs, and that might be a pathway to facility costs, and this would certainly be eligible as a facility cost. ESSER 2 and the assumption would be ESSER 3 that follows would have allowance for use for facilities. That would be a potential pathway to provide those costs, but we just aren't in a position, in my opinion, yet. I'm not in a position to make a recommendation to you there. I think there's more work that we need to do to see what that price point is to get what we want and where we're at there. And I wish we were further in the process, but we are where we are right now. And very similarly, capital projects planning and summer projects, I've started the process now to reach out to the administrators and get their needs and their priorities at their specific buildings. We'll marry that with a capital projects plan, or my recommendation to you later on in the agenda is to approve consolidated construction to create that capital projects 2.0. I did receive an invoice from them, or I shouldn't say an invoice, a quote from them, and that process would be about $4,500, which I think is pretty reasonable considering the scope of the work that they would do. And if you can think of the capital projects plan, the version that was created prior to the referendum, that's what I would envision how that would marry together with capital projects planning and ESSER, because if we can use ESSER funds and the remaining of the bond that was sold for refinancing to be a part of the shared project, I would envision a capital projects plan looking similar to that, where you would have a column that shows ESSER funds and how those feed into the capital projects plan, so you would be able to front load some of those larger ticket expenses. I'll give you a good example. We were looking at the Gustner project, the boiler project there, and the scope of that we were hoping would be far less, but when you got into the engineering costs, that's going to have to be a different priority, because that's quite a bit more expensive than what we hoped in terms of the engineering of replacing that particular boiler. But that's what I would see. That's how I would envision it. The capital projects plan would include its own column for ESSER, any potential ESSER, any potential of the refinancing dollars, and that would be the accountability and transparency to flow through the capital projects plan if we're using ESSER dollars, if we're using those refinance dollars. Just, I think, more easily tracked for everybody. And so that'll be my recommendation moving forward with that. I shared some information. We're continuing to do serial testing. That has been going okay. You know, our Average number is somewhere in the mid-teens generally. We've had as low as 5, as many as 18. But that's okay. We'll continue to do that if it provides some staff with peace of mind as far as where they're at, and it keeps our facility safe. We'll continue to do it. A lot of credit goes to our staff members that I talked about last time that are willing to step up and do that and provide that those testing for us. We still have our priority groups for the vaccine, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that happens sooner rather than later. I know Central Valley Health is doing their very, very best to get to our staff as soon as they can. But that sometimes just takes a period of time. We've also been working with Thrifty White, our local pharmacy, and they received corporate approval to, if they have any additional vaccines left at the end of one of their vaccine days, that they would contact us and we would use that same priority list to get through to the next person on the list. So say they are doing 25 that day and 5, they still have 5 at the end of the day, our staff would have access to those. And that was, like I said, Landon Rachel gave us, or went and got authority to do that from his corporate office. So nice to work with Landon on that, and we really appreciate him willing to do that. Lastly, we also encouraged our staff to look at the vaccine locator. It's a nice tool that you can, and anybody really can look at and see where the vaccine's being provided and if you're eligible for that, and then you can log in and see what those are. You had a question?
I know I'd mentioned even at the last meeting, I know more and more states are prioritizing vaccinating their teachers, especially in light of how this new variant that is expected to take hold by March 1st is impacting younger people, with then the possibility of impacting our teachers more and impacting and maybe having us even looking back where we were back in November with overworked staff trying to cover for buildings. Is there any kind of movement that you've heard of on a state level to prioritize that group? I think especially in light of our North Dakota teachers, who and many teachers, because of fear, weren't in classrooms, ours always were. So it's just me advocating for that group of people who have, since the start of the year, been there every day dedicated. I don't know if there's anything we can do to voice that to the state, but I think it's very important that that group, as essential workers, is advocated for. My 2 cents.
I agree, and I don't know if there's any change in movement of placement in 1B, the priority group, but I can say I know that Central Valley Health is really being a champion and doing the best that they can. And I think Thrifty White, as an example, doing the best that they can. And hopefully, fingers crossed, everybody that wants access to the vaccine that works in a school is able to get it soon. But I know we're starting, so that's a good sign. At least we're moving forward. Yeah, that's certainly something that we know is important, and we hopefully it happens soon. Later on, Mr. Gaylor is going to present to you on a proposal for what's now called the Harvesting Innovation Plan. Essentially, in 2017, Senate Bill 2286 was passed, and that provided a pathway to utilize the instructional waiver procedure to facilitate innovation in schools. Now, you certainly could say that the ability to do that already exists in the instructional waiver procedures, and I would say that that's true. What makes this different, though, what I think makes the Harvesting Innovation Plan and really Senate Bill 2286 different, or the authority given in 2286, is it outlines a specific set of procedures, and that's one of the things that Mr. Gaylor will be talking about, is outlining how procedurally it'll work to ensure that you are getting appropriate level of stakeholder feedback prior to making any change. And I think that's what makes this different, and it allows you to make larger scope change. And I'm not going to steal Mr. Gaylor's thunder. I think he wants a chance to talk about that. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and I think it does a really nice job of putting together a timeline to ensure that all the right steps are taken prior to moving forward with large change. The last thing that I had were just different legislative updates. I'm not going to go through all of them. I did a little bit of that last time. Just draw your attention to a few. If you'll notice that anything that's highlighted in your report, that's just the the latest updates of what's happened in a particular proposal, or excuse me, a different bill. I wanted to draw your attention, now I lost it here. We had talked a little bit about 1202, the Common Schools Trust Fund, moving to the State Investment Board. That failed pretty easily. And so next time you won't even see that, but I wanted to draw your attention to it just because we saw it. I referenced 1281 before, and just encourage you to continue to watch that one, even though that did get a due pass recommendation. That's a little worrisome to me. Anytime we move public education dollars away from public education, that's a little worrisome to me. And I think that's something that bears continuing to watch. With that, really, I'd stand for questions if you have any specific legislation questions or any other questions for my report.
Aaron?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you referenced HB 1111 in here. Is that linked to what, or associated somehow with what Gaylor's going to present to us as well, to some degree?
It's a good question. It will to a degree. Any of the competency-based, there's going to be a connection to that as well. 1111 is basically a study of the various initiatives, and then it would make some recommendations for legislation in the next session. But yes, it would be interconnected. Both of those competency-based would connect to that, to a portion of what Mr. Gaylor is going to talk about.
Any other questions for Rob on this report? None? Okay. Moving on to board education, the ESSER program.
You get me again.
Yeah.
So really what I've outlined is just some information on ESSER. Right now, what we know is ESSER 1, which we've received. You've already approved an application for ESSER 1, but there are some differences between ESSER 1 and what's now being called ESSER 2. Currently, ESSER 2 is in front of the House Appropriations. And one thing I'll tell you, I maybe could have drawn this back to 1388, which is House Bill 1388, which is our school funding bill. Right now, there's quite a bit of discussion around the amount of dollars that are coming into ESSER 2 and what's potentially being proposed for ESSER 3. And I think there is a real potential in 1388, at least at the House level, for that to become 0% and 0%. Real concern from my end that we would defray costs, because those are very limited, 15 uses, and we use that foundation aid amounts. That's what we would use to negotiate. If that's at 0%, that's pretty worrisome to me. I would think of the analogy similar to if at the federal level, the federal government said, you know what, guys, in North Dakota, you don't need as much in road funding. You don't need as much DOT support. You have that big legacy fund. Why don't you just use the legacy fund to do that? That's similar to me to what's being discussed at the appropriations level right now. Hey, school districts, you're getting this large amount of dollars from the federal government. You shouldn't now need these other funds. These are one-time funds. ESSER are one-time funds. And there's a perpetual fund coming, or perpetual funding that comes from our state foundation aid. We need to be thinking about how that would impact, and I think if we get into 0%, that makes our negotiations process a lot harder. That makes operationally things a lot harder, and there's limited use as to what we can use ESSER for. So I just want us to continue to recognize, yes, some of those are big numbers in terms of ESSER programming, but those are one-time dollars. And I think we have an opportunity with those ESSER funds, which I'll get into, to provide some indirect tax relief for people based on some of the facility projects that we might have in place, but I'll get to that in a second. Like I said, ESSER 1, you approved that over the summer. And so with ESSER, they had, I think, 10 or 11 different categories in which you could spend, and you had to write an application that selected specifically, I'm going to use it for this, in this area, I'm going to use it for these types of projects, And so we selected those based on that initial disbursement of around $30 million to the state of North Dakota. For us, that allocation was around $560,000. As we've talked about as a board before, we also then had the resiliency grants, the education core dollars, and we tried to prioritize the use of those dollars, and we sort of left ESSER alone for the time period. So remaining in that, I wrote that in here, we have about a little less than half of that left, around 246,000 of our ESSER dollars remain. But again, we created an application that was approved by the state based on some of the allowable uses of ESSER dollars. When we're talking ESSER 2, so that was $30 million. When we're talking ESSER 2, what has been provided or allocated to the state is around $122 million. So you can see those costs are significantly higher, or I should say those allocations are significantly higher. So we had around 560,000 in ESSER 1. ESSER 2 will be about 2.2 million. The real benefit in my mind from ESSER 2 becomes that you have access then to all of those areas that existed in ESSER 1 plus additional. And I linked that, those allowable uses. And I'll just draw your attention to two of the last ones, which are 14 and 15. 14, school facility repairs and improvements to enable operation of schools to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards and to support student health needs. And 15, inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, and upgrade projects to improve the indoor air quality in school facilities, including mechanical, non-mechanical heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, filtering, purification, and other air cleaning fans, control systems, and window and door repair and replacement. 14 and 15 are very, very broad. But I think we have a tremendous opportunity with ESSER 2 to build that into our capital projects plan and use a large portion, in my mind, my recommendation would be a large portion of dollars from ESSER 2 and build it into our capital projects plan. Kind of the idea of front loading as much as we can to clip the peak, because we know that there are projects that we need to do. I'm going to kind of jump a little bit into what potentially is coming down the road, at least what we find to be likely. So we saw, I provided the allocation that we know that came to the state, or the appropriation to the state, was about $122 million for ESSER 2. ESSER 3 is in the hopper at the federal level, and that's around $400 million. So you can do some math to look at projections of what the state appropriate, or what the Jamestown appropriation might be as well, using the same allowable uses. Again, I think we have a real opportunity here. We know that we have significant facility needs. This might be the best path that we possibly could have imagined to addressing some facility needs. But it needs to be married with the capital projects plan. And that's why I feel so strongly in that recommendation that will come up later, that we invest that $4,500 with Consolidated Construction to help us draft that capital projects plan that would embed the use of these funds. Again, these are one-time dollars. I think we have a real opportunity. That is, honestly, that's what I have for now. Unless there's questions related to ESSER 1, ESSER 2, or potentially ESSER 3, although that's pure speculation at this point.
Any questions for Rob on that, or? None? Okay. Moving on to old business. Is there any old business? Hearing none, moving into new business. We have nothing under activities. Moving to number 2, building and grounds. Letter A, is there direction on the agreement for the JLC? Heidi?
I make a motion that we move this to a different agenda pending further information. I see on the agreement, and based on Dr. Luck's recommendation as well, but an agreement is based around that 500,000, and it sounds like we aren't going to be able to make happen what we need to make happen with that amount, so I move that we wait. But in addition to that, I also encourage the administration to continue to find out more about what it will take and also how the dollars can be best used for this. I think this is an important project. You know, it kind of caps off our shared facilities, and I'd like to see us look at, you know, making sure that it's going to impact the greatest amount of students as possible, as well as maybe even like some bathroom facilities and those kinds of things that we are missing on that end of the building.
Okay. There's a motion?
That was a motion and discussion. The motion is just to
Yep.
hold up.
Seconded by Bob. Any discussion on it? Aaron?
Just a clarification, so within that, they had a $46,000 fee that would be a part of with a given scope of work associated with that. That would, if we were to move forward with that agreement, that would be the cost that would be in front of the board, would be that $46,000, correct?
Correct. That would be their cost to formalize the plan. My concern comes around, well, we need to determine what that scope is and how much that's actually going to cost, or what we can afford for our price point before we engage with the architect. I would like to be further along, and I would like to be able to say, yes, we're going to do at least this, but I don't feel until we've done a little bit more planning that we're in a position to do that. And I fully understand where JLG is and their desire to move forward. I get it. I just don't feel comfortable with making that recommendation and spending those dollars if we're not sure that that's something that we're going to provide yet, or can provide at that, you know, to determine, like I said, where our price point really is.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving on to letter B, capital projects plan update.
As I stated before, I did receive a cost proposal from Consolidated Construction, $4,500 to engage in a capital projects plan update that would include some planning, that would include some board education on construction management at risk, and next steps for us. I recommend that we move forward because it's the best pathway we have to outlining specifically what projects are going to happen in what time period they're going to be prioritized in.
Is there a motion to engage? Heidi?
I make a motion to engage with Consolidated Construction to move forward with the capital projects plan and update our current plan.
Is there a second? Second by Aaron. Any discussion? Jason?
When do they anticipate having that done, or?
I asked for mid-March.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving on to number 3, curriculum and assessment instruction. We have the Innovative Education Program proposal. Adam?
Good evening, everybody. Dr. Luck, thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about this. I know Dr. Luck started to talk about the process, and as he said, and I'll reiterate that when we discussed it, that was one of the key points that we discussed was there are some things on the horizon that we could easily do without going through this process. But as he pointed out, the correct process with stakeholder engagement is most important. And I think that involving you guys in this consideration and this information at this point is exciting. And it's exciting from a lot of different standpoints. It's exciting from that there's legislative support of this, and that it's been that way for several years, that we're in a state that supports innovation in education. And it's also exciting as an educator to think about what's possible for our students, and to know that we have the right people and pieces in place to try to move forward with a process like this. So a big kudos to you, all of your work, as well as the work of our hardworking high school educators. All of this has kind of led to this spot for us, where we're at a spot where we need to start planning for next steps in the future. As Dr. Leck said, Senate Bill 2186 allowed this program to waive century code for anything with the approval of your board and the Department of Public Instruction. Currently, there's Senate Bill 2196, which may make it possible to do what some of the things that we might be thinking about in engaging in this process without going through the process, but in legislative code. And even though the possibility of those exist and the possibility to do some of what we want to do exists without the process, I think it's important to recognize, as Dr. Leck did, that this is a good process to go through. And I just want to walk you through what that process would be tonight. Individual school districts can apply through that Senate Bill 2186 to the Department of Public Instruction for really individualized mission, goals, and objectives around a few specific areas that may allow a school to do things that wouldn't be allowed under current century code. In order to do this, they want schools to effectively plan. And so you start planning a year to a year and a half in advance of when you might be looking to start implementing some of these things. So as we talk about this timeline, we're talking about essentially a planning year with what I think the groups would come to consensus around, a phased implementation for our students. And so we're not talking about overnight change that's simply changing things on the surface. We're talking about the real change process and strategic and very sustainable level of change. So not smoke and mirrors, we're changing all of these things, right? But real sustainable change. And so that planning proposal gets us, going through that process, gets us to that spot where we can lay this out. I know that we have a very innovative strategic plan, and I've working with Dr. Leck on crafting some of these things in this proposal. That was one of the things that was a touch point for us as we looked at where do we want to go. Well, we've already got that roadmap for the next 5 years in the strategic plan. So I think a lot of what can be discussed is really operationalizing and communicating that strategic plan and its objectives to the community, and then with the hope of taking it a step further. As I said, we've got great staff at JHS. We've got great support administratively and in coaching and in curriculum and in central office and with the board. And the question isn't, saying, well, we need to get a lot better at a lot of things. The question is, we're doing really well. How do we take the next step, since we're doing that well and we've got an escape velocity, I would say, from what we've learned and overcome in the last year? How do we capitalize on that to continue to get even better? And one of the models that we look at for the process of innovation is laying a foundation. So this is actually a hierarchical model with safe and supportive and collaborative culture being a foundational element. And at JHS, we've been working for a long time on that collaborative culture through our professional learning communities. I feel confident in where we're at and what we're working on now, that leads us to a place where we can talk about even more. Effective teaching practices. These are things that were laid out in the strategic plan as goals that we continue to work on, and with the support of our instructional coaches, such as Caroline, with the support of our site-based leadership team, with the support of the district and the district improvement group, I feel like we've made significant inroads on a lot of these strategies and will continue to grow in those. Guaranteed and viable curriculum. Our professional learning communities are well-versed in their standards and continue to enhance that. Our work on making sure that we know the set of skills that a student should be able to know and do from a particular course, and that it's actually within a time frame where they can learn that deeply. We haven't yet begun to discuss things like standards referenced reporting or competency-based education, which are a lot more down that continuum of personalization for students. We've been exploring for some time deeper learning, mastery learning, personalized pathways. We have a lot of great and innovative discussions around those things. These are 3 organizations: the Deeper Learning Organization, the Partnership for 21st Century Learning, the New Vision for Education, that have resources that I would like to, through this process, guide people through to understand what those models of education are and what they look like and what the outcomes are for students in those models. So the planning process is fairly well laid out by the state. The first portion of that would be to set up your rationale and vision. Not that it's, this is not replacing the strategic plan, but rather at the high school level, operationalizing that strategic plan. And it helps you set some of those priorities so that you can have sustainable implementation, so that we're not pushing farther and faster than what our resources can handle. In that process, it also asks you to lay out who's involved in the stakeholder engagement. So you probably see that section in that proposal that's in the board agenda, that it requires your support, administrative at the central office level support, educator engagement, support and engagement with Jamestown Middle School, who is not just our feeder school and we share staff with, but that we share a lot of ideas and operationalizing the strategic plan we look at as a joint goal, and so they will definitely be engaged in this process as well. Community engagement, and you can see that some of the groups that were listed in that plan and proposal there, as well as student and parent voice. It does require school board approval to apply, so we're starting with the information and then would move in the near future, I think, to a process of approval. And what are we actually planning to propose? There's a organization, Battelle for Kids, many school districts across the state, in fact, a group of stakeholders across the state that represented school districts have gone through a process of creating what they call a portrait of a graduate. Essentially what it is, and I'll show some examples shortly here, it lays out what are the skills, dispositions, competencies that you would want in your graduate. So not only what are our graduation requirements in terms of course structure, but what are the skills that we want our graduates to have, so that we can be sure that we align our system and our innovations to what that profile of a graduate for Jamestown looks like. We also, after we develop that vision of what we want for all of our kids as graduates from Jamestown High School, we then research what are those innovations that align with both our strategic plan and result in us achieving that portrait of a graduate. So those things that we could evaluate would be, how do we deliver education? How do we administer education? How do we increase opportunities for students? And then increase academic success for students as well. In that process, we might recommend innovative methods, such as the competency-based piece that we talked about, innovative strategies or practices, innovative opportunities for students, or innovative scheduling that may not have been allowed under previous century code. Those would be the sorts of things that we would discuss in those stakeholder meetings, and then that would come back to the school site. Educators would obviously be involved throughout that process, but come back for the school site to lay out an implementation plan, essentially. And that implementation plan would include that focus on sustainability and professional learning for staff, a process for how we're going to evaluate if and how we're making progress, and then proposal for if there are any graduation requirement changes, how that would be phased in. I've always felt that it's best to phase those things in, because a lot of our students who are graduating 5 years from now are beginning their graduation planning now as 8th graders. This is an example of, I was part of a committee that looked at and completed this process, representative of several school districts across the state, and created what's essentially called a portrait of a graduate, or some call them a profile of a graduate. So this one outlines these 7 essential skills: critical thinking, empathy, learner's mindset, perseverance, communication, collaboration, and adaptability as the core set of skills that they want all of the graduates of North Dakota to have. And then they go to outline the specific competencies that are aligned with that. So this is the visual image of what could be created. And then behind that, there's a document that's several pages long that outlines what types of, or more specifically, what those skills are. And then you align your system to get evidence and practice and growth from students towards those outcomes. The actual process to complete that is to start where we're at right now, plan the engagement process, get a design team that's representative of the community together, create that visual and story of where we want to go, and then adopt a portrait of a graduate for implementation. Once we have that portrait of a graduate, now we've got our purpose and vision established. There's another group that I'm fortunate to represent that's within the state, and that has a few different school districts that are focused on how do we help communicate some of these outcomes both to our students and to our community, and that's called the Mastery Transcript Consortium. So there's a group within our state, but there's a group within all of the other 50 states as well, and they work with higher education. They work with K-12 schools as well on how do you make this change and how do you make it sustainable. So we've got our purpose and vision from our strategic plan, our graduate profile, and then we would move into discussing how could our learning model better support that profile of a graduate, how do we align our structures, and then how do we make that change sustainable. And this group is I'd say some of the more progressive school districts across the state that are working on this and have a good grasp of what that change can look like. They may be further in the process than we are, and there may be some things that we're further along in the process than they are. And what we do is we learn together on that, and I feel that we're in a good spot where we could lead a group of stakeholders from the community to understand what some of those changes might be and to plan for implementation of some of those, should that be what the course of the group goes towards. I just offer this as just an example. This is from the Mastery Transcript website. You can check that out there. And I'm not saying that this is maybe the innovation that we land or that we're hanging our hat on, but I just wanted you to have a visual of what this could look like. they have advanced credits, foundational credits, and they define those because in a true mastery or competency-based program, we're about helping everybody to get to that foundational level and making sure that our advanced students have those advanced opportunities as well, so that you can see how much more holistic and well-rounded and communicative of what the skills of a student or the areas of emphasis of a student would be than maybe a traditional transcript might be. This could be, and in fact often is, in addition to a traditional transcript, because we want to be sure that we're preparing students for whatever they choose and to be able to communicate what they've accomplished as a JHS graduate. So what they do is they work with schools to align a graduation requirements and a profile of a graduate to be representative of what those skills and dispositions and knowledge are that we want all of our students to have. You can see on the right, this just happens to be an example of a student's almost portfolio, but specific pieces of evidence that they've submitted. So whether that's a museum project or an essay outlining an opinion on the Constitution, students would submit artifacts that essentially demonstrate mastery of those concepts that we outline in our profile of a graduate. Behind all of this is the structure of coursework that we're all very familiar with in determining what courses a student takes. That helps determine what types of evidence they produce towards that mastery transcript. So that's really a brief synopsis of what that could look like if that's one of the outcomes that stakeholder group feels strongly that we continue to pursue. As I said before, I think that our strategic plan is visionary and provides us with a good guide for the next 5 years. And essentially what we're trying to do is take this and operationalize it, but doing it the right way through a stakeholder engagement process so that we bring this back to life in front of our staff and in front of our community again, that these are the things that we want to hang our hat on, that we have students practicing those skills, and we do today, and we'll continue to get better at that into tomorrow. That students should have personalized, authentic experiences that really integrate with our community and they find meaningful, and that we continue to keep that value in front of us that was in our last strategic plan, which is so important to us all, and that's learning for all. So I just wanted to briefly, although I'm not very good at the brevity part yet, outline what that process is and ask if you have any questions about what that process would be. And thank you for your support and consideration at when we get the final proposal in front of you for that.
Any questions for Adam? Gail?
How does this integrate with or work with Choice Ready, or is it something on top of that, or are they linked?
So there's a few things at play in the legislature that we want to pay attention to. One of those is a proposal to align the state scholarship with Choice Ready. And I think that there's it's imperative that we align our system and our profile of a graduate to what those outcomes are too, because I don't see those changing. I see them being enhanced. And one of the pieces of Choice Ready is that we can quantify, monitor, and provide feedback to students on 21st century skills, and then certify competency of 21st century skills. And this is one way to be able to do that effectively. Mm-hmm.
Jason?
Thank you for the information. It's we went through this process at the Center for Distance Education in Fargo, so it is a good way to take the next step forwards. My question is, like, these stakeholder groups, representative stakeholder groups, what would that not necessarily specifically who, but I guess I see the outline here, April, May, June, July, August. Would we be talking about a large amount of teachers we're asking to do this, or any insight yet on what that would look like?
Sure. So it's important to gather input, I feel, and to have a representative group and a group that's going to be good at communicating within their spheres of influence. And so we have a site-based leadership team at the high school. It may be some of those same people, and it may be others. In terms of community members, I've listed maybe the broad categories that we would want. You don't want such a large group that it becomes unwieldy, and so I don't envision that group, being any larger than maybe what we could house within our library or a room like this. I can't remember how many we had in the strategic plan, probably about 25 or 30. Yeah, so it would be probably targeting around that 20 to 25 number as well, which would include some board representation. And so if that's a particular interest for anybody, that opportunity will come.
Any other questions for Rob? Aaron?
Yeah, just to kind of, if you could just maybe sum up at a little bit higher level here is what you're trying to accomplish with this. So are you looking at tailoring a curriculum to a given student or a category of curriculum, or what? Just
No,
at a little bit higher level, could you just kind of sum up what it is that you're trying to achieve?
Sure. So we don't have any specific outcome with any certain category of student in mind. What we have is a vision of more authentic, meaningful, personalized learning for students that could include new pathways for both students who want to accelerate and increase their opportunities, but then also to ensure that we have learning for all students. As you look at the concept of learning for all, and we still have students that will come into our schools, whether that's moving from another district or within our district that might be reading not at a 9th grade level, but at a 4th or 5th grade level. We want to be able to support them in what their goals and ambitions and aspirations are, and the skills that we know they're going to need to succeed in the future. And we want to have a pathway that doesn't hold any of our students that, at this point might be more advanced in what their trajectory or their pathway might be. So I think it's thinking about credits and issuing credits flexibly and differently to allow more personalization of what that pathway could be.
Aaron?
And then in your write-up, I noticed you mentioned several times the involvement with the CTC, but I didn't see it in your presentation. Could you just describe what level of involvement they'd have in this process then too?
Sure, yeah. Again, just as we've got a good relationship with Jamestown Middle School as a feeder school, JVCTC, which with the restructure that we did previously, we have good communication with them as well. They'd be involved as a stakeholder in this group, and they are also impacted by what those outcomes might be. And so we've got surrounding districts that are part of JVCTC, and we want to make sure that whatever we do, that structure is still able to support them and their needs. I guess, personally, I've grown a lot in my understanding of CTE, as well as my understanding of what those needs are. So I feel confident that we can get the right people in the room to make sure that they feel included, and that that's a good process for them.
Any other questions? Oh, Bob?
Do you see working with the University of Jamestown on this for students that advanced maybe and looking for more challenges than what the high school can offer sometimes?
Yeah, we've got a great relationship. I think it's really, Dr. Leck has had quite a few collaborations with them in the last couple of years that's really increased what we're able to offer together. I think that we want to be mindful of how their scheduling works so that we can make that work for more kids. Currently, one of the limitations that we have to that is that usually we have to have a student take 2 periods off from us to be able to get to a course at University of Jamestown. And typically, the majority of students that are taking those courses are students that maybe have a parent that's employed there. But we've gotten some dual credit opportunities in place. One example would be the Intro to Education course that we've got that I think is an exciting opportunity where we can think about, whether their instructor is teaching it or our instructor is teaching it, what those might look like. I can't speak for University of Jamestown, but they definitely have been a good partner and would be involved in this too to make sure we've got a,
Go ahead, Bob.
yeah.
Excuse me. Sometime in the future, I'd really be interested in hearing from kids that are taking the Intro to Education course and see how they are, if they're still thinking about a career in education, because that is the gateway course to getting your education degree. So just, it's always nice to have students come in here and like to know how that's working for them and if their aspirations are still along the same line now that they've been in a classroom, different from a student.
Yeah, I
Mr.
think-
Toso, I will say that it's fewer students are interested after my school finance discussion with them a month or so ago. I think it's fewer, but I think still a good number.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the board, or Rob, you had comments?
I did. I want to thank Mr. Gaylor for coming. A lot of planning has gone into this, and I want to give him credit for that. And I think it's a very forward-thinking proposal. From a board approval standpoint, this is the introduction. Our first meeting in March 1st, would be the opportunity to vote on this planning proposal. The other thing, it's purposeful, the way this agenda has been structured, because we want to connect a few dots for you, and just to share a little bit of perspective from me. I talked in board education about ESSER. I outlined the purpose of ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and the potential for ESSER 3. And I want you to think as a board, at least understand my perspective in how we, as I move forward and make recommendations with ESSER, and I want you to understand how I'm thinking. The first that we need to think about is, what's our current environment? We're teaching in a pandemic, and there are costs that we have, and that's really the intention of ESSER. We're in a far different situation as a state than many other states, and I think we have some opportunities. But we have to consider that we have some costs associated with teaching in a pandemic, and we need to think of that basket. So think of 3 different pathways. That's certainly one basket that we need to think about, is what's happening currently right now. What our environment are our teachers in? What additional support do they need in terms of teaching in a pandemic? You have an opportunity to invest. That's the second bucket. I talked about that before with our capital projects plan. There's an opportunity to invest in our district in different opportunities. And that could be looking at our technology. That could be, addressing some long-term facility needs. And so we have an opportunity to invest. And I want you to think about the third bucket, which is what Mr. Gaylor is talking about, and that's the opportunity to innovate. I think if we craft a plan and budgets for ESSER that address all of those, the current environment, our investments, how we're investing in our district, and how we're innovating, I think we'll have done a very good job in utilizing ESSER funds. And I think this is really an outstanding first step to seeing what some of the innovations are going to need to be in our district and how we might be able to fund them. So that's just my 2 cents on how I think ESSER is really going to tie into this whole process that Mr. Gaylor has outlined for you.
Okay. Any other questions? Heidi?
Thank you, Mr. Gaylor, for your time invested in this. It's actually kind of exciting to hear about things other than COVID and some planning outside of, our planning for COVID. I think due to COVID, we've been forced into some innovation very quickly with education, and this process that you've laid out is a very methodical and thoughtful process to innovative education. And so I do appreciate all the information that you provided us as well as on the slide. And then will we have, in March then, will we have a fiscal amount tied to that as well? Is my
So it's a great question, but no, not yet. I think some of that might come from whatever it is that the team goes to. There might be some cost associated with that, and I'm just, in terms of the process, I don't think there's going to be a fiscal note per se to engaging in the process. It might just be what comes after that, and when we're talking about innovation, that could be the aviation we've been discussing and drone technology. That's a nice way to think of that bucket. Facilities and how that fits into our invest bucket or educational technology. But I think what could come from this is where some of that innovation cost might be. I don't think we're ever going to have an opportunity like this with that ESSER presents to us. And as Mr. Gaylor stated, as you stated, we've been thrust into this a little bit. And I think it's now up to us to take the opportunity to move to the next step.
Any other questions? None? Thanks, Adam. So,
Yes, thank you.
moving on to finance, budget revision. Sally?
The word of the month, budget revisions of every month. As I've talked about in the past, federal guidelines requires that our budget matches what I reported to the state. This year has been kind of a crazy year, and with late finalization of Title II numbers and private schools not be able to determine, what would their dollars best be used in federal, for their programs. And so, there's Title II budget revisions there, getting them into the right line items, and the private school, getting those into the right line items, and plus matching the budget. And then Title I and Title IV is just, matching. Both of those reflect on private schools getting it into the right line item. Actually, no budget changes, just getting those into the right line items. And then, in addition to the Title II and Title I and Title IV budget revisions, the building fund. In September, the board moved forward with the certificate of indebtedness, and I brought that revenue change to you at that time. That, and then later on, the board moved forward to go with the project at UJ, giving them the $2 million. So this budget change is in the expenditure of the building fund for that $2 million. The $58,000 is the fees associated, the professional fees and the global rating fees that are all part of that certificate of indebtedness agreement. So that's what the building fund budget revision is for. And that's what I have for this meeting.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Is there a motion, entertain a motion on the budget revision? Moved by Bob, seconded by Gail. Any other discussion? Hearing none, assuming roll call vote, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving to letter B, the general fund budget is there for your information. If you do have questions, Sally's available to answer those. None? Moving on to monthly financial reports. Motion to approve? Motion by Bob, seconded by Jason. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving to personnel, is there a motion to approve, accept the resignation of Catherine Morehouse, a special education teacher at the middle school at the conclusion of the 2020-21 school year? Motion by Gail. Seconded by Aaron. Any discussion? Like to thank her for her service. No other discussion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Moving to letter B, superintendent's evaluation timeline. That is there for your information. That will be, so if we can make sure that everybody has their evaluations in time or on time and up to date. So we have nothing under policy and procedures or tuition other. Roman numeral 4, items for future agenda. Anything? If there is something up, just let us know and we'll get it on the agenda. We have meetings to be scheduled. We have the Health Insurance Committee meeting on Thursday, February 18th at 3:45 in the Thompson Community Room in the middle school. Our next school board meeting is Monday, March 1st, 5:15 here in the Thompson Community Room. And room number 6 is, oh, go ahead, Heidi.
Yep, there's an SEUC meeting tentatively scheduled for February 24th at 11:30 a.m.
Okay.
So just check the website if anyone's it'll be a virtual meeting.
Okay, sounds good. Moving on to Roman numeral 6, remember, remind everybody to right-click on their superintendent evaluation. It's section 1 and 6, and then also Roman numeral 7 to right-click on our adjournment to assess our meeting. No further business, meeting is adjourned.